Chapter 29 of Lud-In-The-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LaBeouf. Lud-In-The-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. A message comes to Hazel, and the first swallow to Dame Marigold. The information given by Luke Hempin had enabled the authorities in Lud to finally put a stop to the import of fairy fruit. As we have seen, the dapple had been dragged near its source, and wicker frails had been brought up, so cunningly weighted that they could float beneath the surface of the water, and closely packed with what was unmistakably fairy fruit. After that, no further cases of fruit-eating came to Mumchance's notice. But for all that, his anxieties were by no means at an end. For the execution of Endymion Lear came near to causing a popular rising. An angry mob, armed with cudgels and led by Bawdy Bess, stormed the court of the Guildhall, cut down the body, which had been left hanging on the gibbet as an example to evildoers, and bore it off in triumph. And the longest funeral procession that had been seen for years was shortly following it to the fields of Gramarye. The cautious Mumchance considered it would be imprudent to interfere with the obsequies. "After all, your worship," he said to Master Polydore, "the law has had his blood, and if it will mean a little peace and quiet, she can do without his corpse." The next day many of the prentices and artisans went on strike, and several captains of merchant vessels reported that their crews showed signs of getting out of hand. Master Polydore was terrified out of his wits, and Mumchance was inclined to take a very gloomy view of the situation. "If the town chooses to rise, the yeomanry can do nothing against them," he said dejectedly. "We ain't organized, if your worship will pardon the expression, for trouble. No, we ain't." Then, as if by a miracle, everything quieted down. The strikers, as meek as lambs, returned to their work. The sailors ceased to be turbulent, and Mumchance declared that it was years since the yeomanry had had so little to do. "There's nothing like taking strong measures at once," Master Polydore remarked complacently to Master Ambrose, whom he had taken as his mentor in the place of Endymion Lear. "Once let them feel that there is a strong man at the helm, and you can do anything with them. And, of course, they never felt that with poor old Nat." Master Ambrose's only answer was a grunt and a rather sardonic smile, for Master Ambrose happened to be one of the few people who knew what had really happened. The sudden calm was due neither to a miracle nor to the strong hand of Master Polydore. It had been brought about by two humble agents, Mistress Ivy Peppercorn and Hazel Gibberty. One evening they had been sitting in the little parlour behind the grocer's shop over the first fire of the season. As plaintiff and principal witness in the unpopular trial, their situation was not without danger. In fact, Mumchance had advised them to move into Lud till the storm had blown over. But to Hazel, Lud was the place where the widow was buried, and, full as she was of Western superstitions, she felt that she could not bear to sleep enclosed by the same town walls as the angry corpse. Nor would she return to the farm. Her aunt had told her of Master Nathaniel's half-joking plan to communicate with her, and Hazel insisted that even though he had gone behind the Debatable Hills, it was their clear duty to remain within reach of a message. That evening Mistress Ivy was waxing a little plaintive over her obstinacy. "I sometimes think, Hazel, Your wits have been turned, living so long with that bad, bold woman, and I don't wonder, I'm sure, poor child. And if my poor peppercorn hadn't come along, I don't know what would have happened to me. But there's no sense, I tell you, in waiting on here, with the hams and bacon at home, not cured yet, nor the fish salted for winter, nor your fruit pickled or preserved. You're a farmer on your own now, and you shouldn't forget it. And I wish to goodness you'd get all that silly nonsense out of your head. A message from the mayor, indeed. Though I can't get over its being him that came to see me, and me never knowing, but giving him sauce as if he'd been nothing but a shipmate of my poor peppercorns. No, no, poor gentleman, we'll never hear from him. Leastways, not this side of the Debatable Hills. Hazel said nothing, but her obstinate little chin looked even more obstinate than usual. Then, suddenly, she looked up with startled eyes. "Hark, Auntie!" she cried. "Didn't you hear someone knocking?" "What a girl you are for fancying things! It's only the wind," said Mistress Ivy querulously. "Why, Auntie, there it is again! No, no, I'm sure it's someone knocking. I'll just go and see." And she took a candle from the table, but her hand was trembling. The knocking was audible now to Mistress Ivy as well. "You just stay where you are, my girl," she cried shrilly. "It'll be one of those rough chaps from the town, and I won't have you opening the door. No, I won't." But Hazel paid no attention, and though her face was white and her eyes very scared, she marched boldly into the shop and called, "Who's there?" through the door. "By the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west," came the answer. "Auntie, Auntie!" she cried shrilly. "It's from the mayor. He has sent a messenger, and you must come." This brought Mistress Ivy hurrying to her side. Though she was not of an heroic character, she came of good sturdy stock, and she was not going to leave her dead brother's child to face the dangers of the unseen alone. But her teeth were chattering with terror. Evidently, the messenger was growing impatient, for he began beating a tattoo on the door and singing in a shrill, sweet voice. "Maids in your smocks, look well to your locks, and beware of the fox when the bellman knocks." Hazel, not without some fumbling, for her hands were still trembling, drew the bolts, lifted the latch, and flung the door wide open. A sudden gust of wind extinguished her candle, so they could not see the face of the messenger. He began speaking in a shrill, expressionless voice, like that of a child repeating a lesson. "I have given the password so you know from whom I come. I am to bid you go at once to Lud-In-The-Mist, and find a sailor, by name Sebastian Thug. He will probably be drinking at the tavern of the Unicorn. Also a deaf-mute commonly known as Bawdy Bess, whom you will probably find in the same place. You will have need of no other introduction than the words, 'By the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west.' You are to tell them that there is to be no more rioting, and that they are to keep the people quiet, for the Duke will send his deputy. And next you will go to Master Ambrose Honeysuckle and bid him remember the oath which he and Master Nathaniel pledged each other over Wild Thyme Gin, swearing to ride the wind with a loose rein, and to be hospitable to visions. And tell him that Lud-In-The-Mist must throw wide its gates to receive its destiny. Can you remember this?" "Yes," said Hazel in a low, puzzled voice. "And now, just a trifle to the messenger for his pains." And his voice became gay and challenging. "I am an orchard thief and the citizen of a green world. Buss me, green maid." and before Hazel had time to protest, he gave her a smacking kiss on the lips, and then plunged into the night, leaving the echoes of his "ho-ho-ho" like a silvery trail in his wake. "Well, I never did!" exclaimed Mistress Ivy in amazement, adding with a fat chuckle, "It would seem that it isn't only this side of the hills that saucy young fellows are to be found. But I don't quite know what to make of it, my girl. How are we to know he really comes from the mare?" "Well, Auntie, we can't know, of course, for certain, though for my part I don't think he was a Doramarite. But he gave the password, so I think we must deliver the messages. There's nothing in them, after all, that could do any harm." "That's true," said Mistress Ivy, "though I'm sure I don't want to go trudging into Lud at this time of night on a fool's errand. But after all, a promise is a promise, and doubly so when it's been given to somebody as good as dead." So they put on their pattens and cloaks, lighted a lantern, and started off to walk into Lud, as briskly as Mistress Ivy's age and weight would allow, so as to get there before the gates were shut. Master Ambrose, as a senator, would give them a pass to let them through on the way back. The Unicorn was a low little tavern down by the wharf, of a not very savoury reputation. And as they peeped in at the foul, noisy little den, Hazel had considerable difficulty in persuading Mistress Ivy to enter. "And to think of the words we have to use, too," the poor woman whispered disconsolately. "They're not at the best of times the sort of words I like to hear on a woman's lips. But in a place like this you can't be too careful of your speech. It's never safe to swear at folks in liquor." But the effect produced by the words was the exact opposite of what she had feared. On first crossing the threshold they had been greeted by hostile glances and coarse jests, which on one of the revellers, recognizing them as two of the protagonists in the trial, threatened to turn into something more serious. Whereupon, to the terror of Mistress Ivy, Hazel had made a trumpet of her hands and shouted, with all the force of her strong young lungs, "Sebastian Thug and Mistress Bess, by the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west." The words must indeed have contained a charm, for they instantly calmed the angry company. A tall young sailor, with very light eyes and a very sunburned face, sprang to his feet, and so did a bold-eyed, painted woman, and they hurried to Hazel's side. The young man said in a respectful voice, "You must excuse our rough and ready ways when we first saw you, missy. We didn't know you were one of us." And then he grinned, showing some very white teeth, and said, "You see, pretty fresh things don't often come our way, and sea dogs are like other dogs, and bark at what they're not used to." Bawdy Bess's eyes had been fixed on his lips, and his last words caused her to scowl and toss her head. But from Hazel they brought forth a little, not unfriendly, smile. Evidently, like her aunt, she was not averse to seafaring men. After all, sailors are apt to have a charm of their own. When on dry land, like ghosts when they walk, there is a tang about them of an alien element. And Sebastian Thug was a thorough sailor. Then, in a low voice, Hazel gave the message, which Thug repeated on his fingers for the benefit of Bawdy Bess. He insisted on conducting them to Master Ambrose's, and said he would wait outside for them and see them home. Master Ambrose made them repeat the words several times, and questioned them closely about the messenger. Then he took 2 or 3 paces up and down the room, muttering to himself, "Delusion! Delusion!" Then he turned suddenly to Hazel and said sharply, "What reason have you to believe, young woman, that this fellow really came from Master Nathaniel?" "None, sir," answered Hazel, "but there was nothing for us to do but to act as if he did." I see. You too ride the wind. That's the expression, isn't it? Well, well, we are living in strange times." and then he sank into a brown study, evidently forgetful of their presence, so they thought it best quietly to steal away. From that evening the rabble of Lud-In-The-Mist ceased to give any trouble. When the yeomen stationed on the border were recalled to Lud and spread the news that they had seen Master Nathaniel riding alone towards the Ilfin marches, Dame Marigold was condoled with as a widow, and went into complete retirement, refusing even to see her oldest friends, although they had all come to regret their unjust suspicions of Master Nathaniel, and were, in consequence, filled with contrition, and eager to prove it in services to his wife. Occasionally she made an exception for Master Ambrose, but her real support and stay was old Hempy. Nothing could shake the woman's conviction that all was well with the Chanticleers, and the real anchor is not hope, but faith, even if it be only somebody else's faith. So the gay, snug little room at the top of the house, where Master Nathaniel had played when he was a little boy, became Dame Marigold's only haven, and there she would spend the most of her day. Though Hempy never forgot that she was only a vigil, nevertheless in her own way she was growing fond of her. Indeed, she had almost forgiven her for having spilled her cup of chocolate over her sheets when, after her betrothal, she had come on a visit to Master Nathaniel's parents. Almost, but not quite, for to Hempy the Chanticleer's linen was sacrosanct. One night, at the beginning of December, when the first snow was lying on the ground, Dame Marigold, who had almost lost the power of sleep, was tossing wakefully in her bed. Her bedroom ran the whole length of the house, so one of its windows looked out on the lane, and suddenly she heard what sounded like low knocking on the front door. She sat up and listened. There it was again. Yes, someone was knocking at the door. She sprang from bed, flung on a cloak, and hurried downstairs, her heart beating violently. With trembling fingers, she drew the bolts and flung wide the door. A small, slight figure was cowering outside. "Prunella!" she gasped, and with a sort of sob, Prunella flung herself into her mother's arms. For some minutes they stood crying and hugging each other, too profoundly moved for questions or explanations. But they were roused by a scolding voice from the stairs. "Dame Marigold, I'm ashamed of you, that I am, not having more sense at your age than to keep her standing there when she must be half frozen, poor child. Come up to your room this minute, Miss Prunella, and no nonsense. I'll have your fire lighted and a warming pan put in your bed." It was Hempy, candle in hand, frowning severely from under the frills of an enormous nightcap. Prunella rushed at her, half laughing, half crying, and flung her arms round her neck. For a few seconds Hempy allowed herself to be hugged, and then, scolding hard all the time, she chivied her up to her room. And when Prunella was finally settled in her warm bed, with an inexorable expression she strode in, carrying a cup of some steaming infusion. It was black-currant tea, for the brewing of which Hempy was famous, and it had always been one of her grievances against Dame Marigold and Prunella that they detested the stuff and refused to drink it even when they had a bad cold, for it had always been loved by all true Chanticleers, from old Master Josiah downwards. "Now, miss, you just drink that down, every drop of it," she said severely. Prunella was too exhausted that night to tell them her adventures, but the next morning she gave a confused account of wanderings at the bottom of the sea, and how they had lost their way in a terrible marine jungle, out of which they had been guided by Master Nathaniel. It was evident that she had no very clear recollection of what had happened to her since her flight from Lud, or rather, since Professor Wisp had given his first dancing lesson. The other crab-apple blossoms returned to their respective homes the same night as Prunella, and each gave a different account of their adventures. Moonlove Honeysuckle said they had danced wildly down the waste places of the sky, and then had been imprisoned in a castle in the moon. Viola Vigil said they had been chased by angry trees into the dapple, where they had got entangled in the weeds and could not extricate themselves, and so on. But on one point all the accounts agreed, namely, that it had been Master Nathaniel Chanticleer who had delivered them. End of chapter 29.